Can you imagine how much fun it is to run a Center for Art and Environment that acts more like an astrophysics lab sometimes? So stretching space and time is one of these themes that runs through the Art of the Greater West and runs through the museum. I'm going to bring up Joanne Northrup to kind of kick off our Unsettled morning. So once again, Joanne.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Jonathan. That was amazing. 2017 is the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of when the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. We celebrate Alaska Day every October 18th, marking the day when the formal transfer of the territory was finalized. So it's fitting today that we have a speaker who is an Alaskan through and through, Dr. Julie Decker. Decker has been a game changer at the Anchorage Museum, where she served as director and CEO since 2013 after joining the museum as chief curator in 2011. Decker positioned the Anchorage Museum to be the key cultural institution in the circumpolar North and a leader for discussions of the North throughout the world. She did this by originating Polar Lab, a research institute which combines exhibitions, scholarship, public programming, and community outreach to explore the current and future state of the North through culture, community, and the environment. Last month, the Anchorage Museum opened their new Alaska exhibition, revealing the identity of Alaska through its people. It had been the same since 1986 and was beloved among the populace. But she went for it. Decker's not afraid to make waves to help her institution evolve into a museum of the 21st century. Simultaneously, she opened the new 31,000 square foot Rasmussen wing to fulfill the museum's mission of focusing on the North. She's been a little busy. Over the past 2 years, she's also been working with me on the Unsettled exhibition, proposing works from the Anchorage Museum's collection that we integrated, drawing my attention to contemporary Alaska Native artists that are doing something really different, and contributing an excellent essay to the book. And it's also, to my mind, very worthy to note that Decker has attended every art and environment conference that we've had since 2008. Today, I'm delighted to introduce her as someone who I consider to be a friend, a colleague, and an extraordinary partner in organizing the Unsettled exhibition. She's also someone who possesses that certain something that I call cool. She's really cool, and it's not just because she's from the Arctic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Decker.
Thank you. So this is the Anchorage Museum, which is a place at the southern edge of Alaska from which we look at Alaska's place in the globe. And when I first came to Reno 8 years ago, it was for this conference, as Joanne mentioned, and I was surprised that I felt this kinship with Nevada. But Alaska and Nevada share some elements: an extreme environment, a dated frontier narrative that's not very inclusive, an indigenous land, a testing ground, remnants of massive military intervention, nuclear testing, vast scale, boom and bust, stereotypes, ghost towns, and colonization, and even deserts. The last places people expect to be a beacon for contemporary art, critical thinking, and institutions as catalysts. But here we are. The Anchorage Museum shares with the Nevada Museum of Art a radical mindset, a place-based focus, a recognition that art and the environment is the narrative of our time and of our future, and that we, at the periphery, are at the best place to end up at the center. So Alaska is essentially a geographic anomaly. We're the most northern, western, and eastern state in the United States. The tip of the Alaskan Aleutian Islands lay beyond the 180-degree meridian longitude, which is measured from Greenwich, placing part of its chain in the eastern hemisphere. In other words, it would be a shorter trip to travel to Greenwich if you headed west than it would be if you went east. Here is essentially the same map view. This time from Stanley Kubrick's black comedy of doomsday Cold War politics, featuring an accidental, inadvertent, preemptive nuclear attack. The film was a response to the apocalyptic fears of the 1950s. The Earth is without sign of man. The narrator drones on about a top-secret doomsday machine being constructed in the Arctic that could reduce the world to nothingness. And here is a slightly different view of the map. Home of perhaps another doomsday machine, speaking of Unsettled. This is not something far-fetched in Alaska. It's something we know is possible. Alaska's westernmost distinction has placed it into the path of war. During World War II, Japan invaded a portion of the United States in Alaska and held the land for more than a year. That location was Alaska, specifically the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. Alaska was also host to Project Chariot to experiment with peaceful uses for nuclear explosions, as if there could be such a thing, 30 miles from an Inuit village. So this is perhaps the Wild West we know in Alaska, a place long strategic, long associated with cold and the Cold War, the place to test metal, man, politics, and power. Far different from the Wild West Alaska of reality television. There are now more than 40 reality television shows about Alaska. And far different from the insider view of a place not discovered, not of settlers, not unpopulated, not of destruction, but a home to indigenous people who thrived, a place where environment was not a wild wilderness, but a land that was in a reciprocal relationship with its people. Indigenous peoples of Alaska have sustained their unique worldviews and associated knowledge systems for millennia, even while undergoing major social upheavals. Many of the core values, beliefs, and practices associated with those worldviews have survived, and they're beginning to be recognized as having an adaptive integrity that is as valid for today's generations as it was for generations past. And actions currently being taken by Indigenous people in communities throughout the world clearly demonstrate that there's a significant paradigm shift underway in which Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing are beginning to be recognized as consisting of complex knowledge systems with an adaptive integrity of their own. In other words, we have something to learn. The depth of Indigenous knowledge, rooted in the long inhabitation of a particular place, offers lessons that can benefit everyone as we search for a more satisfying and sustainable way to live on this planet. It is not only the coast of Alaska that is eroding. Before he became a poster boy for white nationalism and the far right, and long before he rose to his current level of political power, Steve Bannon ran an investment banking firm called Bannon & Company and was hired to help a company called Space Biosphere Ventures out of its financial troubles. Biosphere 2 was meant to lay groundwork for future space colonization missions, as well as to act as an environmental and social experiment. 8 scientists were to be locked into a 3-acre dome containing 5 different earthly biomes for 2 years, from September 1991 to September 1993. The goal was to see if humans could survive and become self-sufficient in a closed system. That is, one that was not supposed to have any supplies coming in or out. Texas philanthropist Ed Bass, who'd inherited his family's oil fortune but took on ecological causes, poured $200 million into the project, but hired Bannon in 1993 to stop the huge runaway costs of an experiment gone awry. The project was the inspiration for this film spoof Biodome, starring Pauly Shore. The story has some parallels to today as we contemplate living in the Anthropocene. Almost 30 years ago, Steve Bannon was talking about global change and greenhouse gases affecting the Earth's atmosphere. He spoke of extraordinarily high CO2, high nitrous oxide, and high methane. We are still talking a lot about sustainability in the Arctic and ways to be resilient, though these have been resilient places for thousands of years. Fry Otto's proposal to house 40,000 people in a mile-wide dome in the Arctic Circle reflected the zeitgeist of the 1970s, a concern about ecological future combined with the promise of a better tomorrow. The Arctic City would be situated on an estuary with a harbor for shipping access and an airport on the outskirts. The city would be built in tandem with a nuclear power station, which would provide energy, as well as heating the air for the city and the water of the harbor to keep it perpetually ice-free. The roof would be like a sloping skin, less susceptible to wind, snow, and changing loads. Once the dome was inflated, the internal pressure was at the correct balance, the city inside could be built. There would be 4 main entrances and exits, and they would be connected to the various external facilities. A submerged ring road in the dome would connect the housing for a maximum of 40,000 people with a central administration area and a recreation district, while pathways and moving sidewalks at ground level would lead between the various functions. In case of emergency, such as the loss of power or a roof collapse, all the built-up areas would be connected via secure basement levels, which would receive supplies even if the ground level was inaccessible. The fresh Arctic air, warmed by the power plant, would be distributed within the buildings and would be vented out by fans at the periphery of the dome. The weather would not be static. It would change with the climate outside, but would never drop below freezing. The ground level would be landscaped and planned, including a botanical garden and a small forest, while the city would include apartments, an athletics field, hotels, restaurants, a city hall, educational buildings, offices, and even light industry. Above, at the level of the inside of the dome, movable sails could screen the continuous sunlight of the polar summer to maintain a rhythm, while in winter a heavy-duty artificial sun lamp could be driven along suspended tracks for the same purpose. Arctictopia. The Russians were the first to really prefabricate the Arctic, creating this as the new vernacular in the Arctic. Many prisoners of the Gulag died building Arctic structures on the permafrost. Today, Russia knows the Arctic as a strategic investment, though the US has faded in the last year from the race to own it. Putin has made an appeal to the UN to annex 380,000 square miles of Arctic seabed due to the existence of oil and gas. But also they've imagined Arctic cities, such as one on a Siberian island, to be known as Umka, housing 5,000 residents underneath a huge dome. The city would be spared from the harsh winter by the shelter, living instead in a sealed environment. Researchers could live there permanently. For $6.4 billion, workers could be provided with this luxury environment, with houses, parks, swimming pools, hotels, schools, and a cathedral. In 2015, President Barack Obama became the first sitting president to set foot above the Arctic Circle, visiting Kotzebue on Alaska's northwest coast, which sits on a gravel peninsula roughly 10 feet above an increasingly destructive Chukchi Sea. At the time, Alaska was one of the poorest mapped places on the planet. Some of the coastal charts still use data compiled by Captain Cook. We actually had far better topographic maps of Mars and the moon than of the state of Alaska. With Obama's visit, Alaska became mapped in a new way. A year ago, the National Science Foundation and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency released the most accurate digital elevation maps of Alaska ever created. These maps are sharp enough to detect the rapid changes that a warming climate is creating in the topography of Alaska. Arctic DEM, as the project is known, is rolling out with Alaska, but by the end of 2017, after a supercomputer in Illinois has crunched all of the satellite data, it will cover the entire Arctic above 60 degrees north latitude in Canada, Russia, and other Arctic countries. And of course, to show that the West was one, Obama also filmed an episode of Bear Grylls on a melting Alaska glacier. But comparisons of Alaska to Mars are not new. The conditions of Mars are quite different than anything experienced on Earth. Mars is much colder than even the Arctic. The average Martian temperature is minus 81 degrees Fahrenheit, and the planet's atmospheric pressure is lower than Earth's. But Alaska has some of the same features in terms of ice avalanches. Scientists are not sure what causes the giant ice avalanches on Mars, but we have some idea of what may be causing them with increased frequency in Alaska. The sun is now warming layers of ice. As the sun grows warmer in Alaska, we have rapidly melting permafrost that will change how we live. Residents of a small Alaskan village voted last year to relocate their entire community from a barrier island that has been steadily disappearing because of erosion and flooding attributed to climate change. Shishmaref residents voted 89 to 78 to leave. The plan would move the village, which is 120 miles north of Nome, to one of two sites on the Alaska mainland about 5 miles away. And Shishmaref is an Inupiat community of about 600 people on an island north of the Bering Strait that is about 1/4 mile wide and 2.5 miles long. It has been grappling for decades with the loss of buildings and infrastructure caused by storm surges, and it has shrunk over the past 40 years. More than 200 feet of the shore has been eaten away since 1969. Climate change is not new in Alaska. We've imported ideas and models to our West. The North has been the great borrower, but we know our future is about invention, not imitation. For the indigenous, some of the best architecture has existed in the clothing, like the Unangan waterproof raincoats women sewed using the gut or the intestine of large sea mammals. This kind of thinking in architecture is sustainable and has sustained humans. Of Northern European countries, the Danes say they are the most sustainable. But as Kai U. Bergman of Big Architects said, the only proof is that they put on a sweater and they bike to work. How we live in our environment shouldn't just be about giving things up, not just about flying less and using swell design water bottles. It should be about figuring out how to use what you discard, the byproducts of our existence, something indigenous people have known for longer than anyone. This is the outside, the romantic view of the Alaskan West. Untouched, barely inhabitable, a rugged place for rugged, independent people and pioneers. Documentary filmmaker Rick Burns called Alaska America's unconscious, that place of the last wilderness, our dream of a place preserved, unchanging, wild. The nostalgia for wild, remote places has prompted this kind of last chance tourism, not just for Alaska, but for all of the Arctic, and not just for cruise ship passengers, but for artists, scientists, filmmakers, and others who now flock to our West to document its plight and its icons. The insiders, the locals, become the subjects of interviews and stereotypes of peril. Indeed, our landscape is changing. Alaska is host to all of the world's key issues: post-oil economies, immigration, climate change, forest fires, equity, food security. And it is home to its own kind of DIY, make-it attitude and technology, as giant holes open up in the Arctic landscape. People all over the world are studying how to think about the futures. And then it's trendy. The Arctic has become sexy, the place to go to get your Instagram stats up, or the place to join. And Maine and Scotland have lately joined the Arctic, and Arctic university programs and conferences populate the latest universe. And in many ways, it is the art and architecture that first responds. The portrayals of Alaska's landscape today are not the romantic views of artists like Thomas Hill, who went west, but a different kind of romanticism, and a nostalgia and longing, and an activism for the landscapes of our past. And the art of our time and place is maybe not the art of spectacle, though we do need to export the voice of the insider. For it is the voice of the people that know this landscape, its past and its future, who can make this West global, who can expand the conversation from the inside out. There are indigenous contemporary artists from Alaska who give voice to change, like Nicholas Galanin. And as you saw yesterday and in the exhibition, this is the work, Things Are Looking Native, and Native is Looking Whiter. Here, Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia merges with a 1906 Edward Curtis image of a young Hopi woman with distinctive squash blossom hairstyle, resembling the iconic hairstyle of Star Wars. So we perpetuate a visual language through our Western ways, decontextualizing images derived from non-Western culture. So indigenous artists comment, push understanding, and disrupt comfort. In this work by Dr. Jane Maynor, Tlingit daggers protect what has been regained. Here, Galanin reminds us of our flawed traditions and perceptions of the American West. In this piece, the American dream is alive and well. And for Galanin, in neon, the documents of our West. And Allison Warden, who raps about past and future, a hip-hop entry into Arctic language, identity, and a history of exploitation of landscape and people. For this is not our West, or this, or really this, or this, or this, or this, well, maybe this. This is our West, a place of complexities, of a strength of people who know how to use their voices. If we learn to live in and respond to an environment, whether this or something in between, we can begin a conversation about a hybrid place, a place of adaptation, a place of resilience. We can look at how the West we share is both flawed and powerful, and that our perception of easternmost, westernmost, southernmost, or northernmost depends on where we stand. Our views of the futures are dependent upon a wider view, a sense of all the tips and lines and ridges of the greater West and beyond. Our northern landscape is relevant, pivotal. We warm and we remain. In our response, we present a new map, not a place at the periphery, but at the center. Thank you.
So if you ever wonder why the Center for Art and Environment has polar archives, there's no more eloquent person to explain that than Julie Decker. Julie also, we were having dinner in Tromsø, Norway, which is above the Arctic Circle, because we were both going in and out of Svalbard, in the city of Longyearbyen. And she said, Bill, why don't you come up to the museum and spend some time with us? And I can't tell you the delight it is to walk into the Anchorage Museum and realize that you come into the front door and immediately to your left is our research center. And you can walk in those doors and you can find a file on every artist in Alaska. And that's been Julie's work. Julie is a scholar of major significance for the circumpolar north and for Alaska. The state is great to have a treasure like that who has put together a comprehensive picture both in individual files and then in large intellectual framework.